All good.
Okay, so welcome to Fountain Pens UK Christmas 2024. And on the first day of Christmas, we give you Nib Thomas Ang, who joins us to talk about all things nibs. So, just a little bit of housekeeping. We ask that during the talk you have your mics off. If you want to ask anything, if you want to pop it into the chat, Approver or I will pick it up and ask, or I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And just to let you know that tonight's talk is actually sponsored by Art from the Heart, and they have given a special gift for us to give to one of the people participating in the chat tonight. So at the end of the talk, I'll randomly select somebody who's on the chat. As long as they're a member of FPUK, I will be in touch and I'll announce the winner, be in touch, and we'll put you in touch with Art from the Heart. So, yeah, any questions before we start? Brilliant. Okay. Well, over to you then, Thomas.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope it'll go well because I'm going to attempt to do a fairly complex grind on stream. But before we start, can everyone see this presentation? Yes? Okay, good. I cooked this up just about half an hour ago, so let's hope it all works. I um Okay, as a nib grinder, I genuinely I prefer the term nib grinder because nibmeister is a very American invention. The Germans would call nibs Feder, so like Federmeister isn't a word they use anyway. So nibmeister, yeah, fine. It's very cool to be one of a fairly small club of people who do this because fountain pens are already such a niche hobby, and so much of kind of fountain pen usage concentrates on inks and papers and what you do with those things. And so often, you can customize your notebook and you can buy as many inks as you want, and then you're faced with, fine, medium, or broad as options when you buy a pen. And of course, if your handwriting is really small like mine, or you want something with a bit more flourish, then your options are very limited unless you know who to look for. And Fountain Pens UK as a group has been really, really good about recommending people, and that's where I started as well. So obviously, the father of us all in this region, I think, is John Soroka. Like, you all know his name. He's legendary. He's been grinding before I was born, and all respect due to him. Um, and that's how I started as well, by learning and studying, not with him directly, but examples. So, how did I begin? Getting started is not the easiest thing. I think it's far easier today because resources are much more easy to come by. You get videos on YouTube, articles that did not used to exist even 5 years ago. So, finding resources. You go on and you search, say, Fountain Pen Network and FP Geeks and places like that. And then it's also like people get really cagey about sharing details sometimes. It took me a while to be able to track John down and to obtain an email that I could actually write to. This took maybe, I had no fountain pen friends at that time, so I was searching a lot on the internet randomly, and I knew that I didn't really want to send my pen all the way to the US to, at the time it was Richard Binder, Mark Barkers, people like that with 3 month waiting lists. I didn't want to do that. As a university student with not a lot of money, thinking about the mail being expensive, possible import costs, things like that, and then being without a pen, that's not great, right? So I thought I might try doing it myself. Um, and then you go into how do you find resources? You get name lists, and these days there are compilations by I think I recall coming across a really fairly comprehensive name list that if you were, English speaking at least, or in Europe and the US, there was a list of people which was really nice. And this was before I started doing the shows, so my name is not on there. And as far as I know, I haven't checked whether it's now on there, but it would be quite nice. Um, then you have to find good resources, like serious write-ups by people who know what they're doing. And this can be quite hard because I found this using a cursory search. I remember in this was probably 2016 or 17. And I grew up with a manuscript set of calligraphy names where they had sections that you could unscrew and plug in, and they had different sizes, 1.5, 2, 3 millimeters. So I was like, okay, I want to turn a pen into an italic. How do I go about that? And I remember in 2017 and 16, people were recommending this. This is horrifying. But this post on Reddit is from only a month ago. People are still doing this. Um, that's mind-boggling to me. I mean, great, it's not an expensive pen, but this is not sustainable, and you would never do this to a gold nib. Like, absolutely not. This is horrifying. So, how do you find good resources, right? That's really, really important. And you look around, there's like a PDF by Richard Binder, which gets passed around a little bit, mostly about nib tuning, but there's stuff in there that helps you get into the really gritty, doing irreversible damage to your pens kind of territory, which is what we're going to do a little bit of tonight. So materials and tools. This is probably the most important thing because you are dealing with pens that cost a good fraction of your monthly salary, if not multiples, right? And you want to do this in a way that does as little damage as possible. So whetstones were the first thing I started with. Knife sharpening stones, which are already known to take metal off metal, right? You sharpen a knife, and a nib is essentially a very small piece of metal. You just have to be really careful. This used to be the way a lot of Japanese nib grinders did their work. Um, you would shape very, very carefully against these surfaces and go from a low grade if you wanted to take material off quickly to a higher grade. And from here, once you know and have practiced the kind of shapes you want, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Once you've practiced the shapes you want, you can go on to using a Dremel or a power tool. So for example, the tool that I'm using tonight, this is actually introduced to me by Jose, whom most of you will have met at the London pen shows. Lovely, lovely guy, amazing. And this is the exact same one he uses. So this is really portable. It spins up by pressing a button and has a rotating dial to adjust how fast I want these things to go. So now I travel with this, whereas I used to travel with my Dremel, which is much larger. This is an actual power tool, and makes quite a noise, so it's rather alarming at pen shows. The other thing that people do have is homemade kits, and this is very interesting because if you've ground enough nibs and have established a workflow and you want to be more efficient, then you can choose to build your own thing. And I saw this CY had one of these machines at the Pacific Northwest Pen Show earlier this year. It's built by a guy called Tsubasa in Japan, and the machine he calls the Pythagoras, which is quite cool. So all of those little that's a switch on off switch, and it's powered by essentially one of those like racing model car kits, the engines from one of those kits. That's 4 different grades of sandpaper slash abrasive material so that he can grind the nib and then polish with very, very little movement. And this just makes it more efficient for him. And this is super portable, right? It's a machine about that large. Doesn't cost much to carry around. Of course, as you see in pen shows, I mean, at the last pen show, at the last London pen show, there were 6 nib grinders. Jose and I used a small machine like this. Annabelle has a foot pedal controlled thing that she uses, and several people have actual machine setups on the tables, and it was very interesting for me to go to the San Francisco Pen Show earlier this year and watch 8 other people doing their work. All of us worked in completely different ways at completely different speeds. But we all do the same thing, right? All we're really looking to do is shape that fraction of a millimeter of metal at the end of a pen. The other things you will want when you're trying to do this is good lighting. So I have this portable lamp here, and it goes like this. And I bring this bring this with me to pen shows because you never know what kind of room they're going to put you in. Uh, and then magnification, whether it's loops or a microscope, like Annabelle uses an actual microscope setup, which is really impressive. Or macro lenses to take cool photos when you're done, like this one, which I found on Instagram. Like that's a really nice shot of a nib. Unfortunately, my lenses are not as good as this one. So for the next few slides, when we talk about different types of tipping, you'll have to bear with like slightly grainy photos. So from here on, I bought something like 20 Jinhao pens to destroy on my knife sharpening tools, and this took a good couple weeks. And I really wanted to see how consistent I could get this. I could get, say, an extra fine. Yeah, I could get a good extra fine in 3 attempts. And then could I reproduce that exactly? Could I reproduce a good italic nib, for example? All these are uh, really important. I see a question here. Do you or would you consider teaching someone to grind? This is a very, very interesting question because uh, I'm essentially self-taught in the sense that I never actually had someone tell me how to do something. What I did was I bought nibs from other grinders. So I have like several people. Um, I have 3 italics from several people. I'll show some photos later, for example. And then I had some nib size reduction done by John Soroka, of course, which is really nice just to see what like a good fine is. And then I tried to imitate that on a whetstone repeatedly until I could do that. So I'm not sure how I would teach someone to do that, but the essential concept is the same, that you always want to be able to reproduce something with good consistency in a good amount of time. Um, when would you recommend that a beginner moves to Dremel tools? Um, so this little setup, I think this cost me less than £50. It is not a huge investment, but it is.
I'm not sure where he's gone.
Is that just me? No. Okay.
No.
Okay, we'll give him a minute. I'm sure he'll rejoin. Do you want to message him, Steph, and see?
I have done.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
No worries. Oh, we've lost him.
That's okay. That means he'll rejoin. That's all right.
Okay. Problem with technology, isn't it? There he is.
Sorry, that was weird. Anyway, to keep answering the question, I have a tray of nibs, and it's just like I 3D printed this thing, right? And it's just a bunch of nibs that go in vials, and I store my Leonardos and my Franklin Christoph pens nibblers. So when I feel like it, I pull one out, and then I match a nib, and off it goes. And uh this makes
Oh
try,
no.
and then you can. Oh,
You cut out again then a bit.
testing.
Yeah, you
Is
good.
okay. It says my internet connection is unstable. I hope it's yeah. So if you do something like that, I have them labeled. For example, a stub nib, a pelican that's been ground, CY stack nibs, for example, a Mike Masuyama. You'll see a close out of the Masuyama italic. Um, if you do this and you buy a lot of nibs, then you end up being able to buy, say, Yovo broads and then grinding them yourself. And if you do that, then maybe it's worth investing in a Dremel. Otherwise, honestly, little knife sharpening stones if you want to make italics, those do really well. Those do really, really well. And then you use micro mesh to smooth it out, and that's enough. Replacement parts on my polishing machine. I don't have a Pythagoras. I got to see one, but replacement parts for these are really cheap because all you do is that's a little part, right? And I have a I just have replacement discs for this. This is just a diamond coated disc, and these are not expensive at all. So I go through like 3 of them a year, and that's perfectly fine. Right. Okay. Going back to, let me share that again. I hope that's up for everyone. Okay, so moving on a little bit, let's talk about types of grind. So what we do at pen shows, this is the bread and butter, right? Like apart from tuning nibs, which is kind of what you learn as well. Size reductions are the most common. Most of the time when you buy a second-hand pen, it's very unlikely to be the perfect nib size you want. Like I buy a bunch of secondhand stuff and my handwriting is tiny, so I want them all to be extra fines or fines. But that's not usually the case. When you buy, a nice Omas or a Mont Blanc, for example, they tend to come in fairly big sizes because that's just the kind of nib that people like on them. So having to regrind them was a good reason for me to start grinding. And then stubs and italics, we'll discuss this a little bit. Essentially, a fat downstroke and a thin cross-stroke, and the difference between a stub and an italic is the contrast between the thick and the thin, and how rounded and easy it is to move, or how forgiving, right? An architect nib is also sometimes called an Arabic or Hebrew, and it's the opposite of a stub and italic. So a thin downstroke and a fat cross-stroke. This is a little more troublesome, a more fussy, because when I grind something like that, I have to match that to the user's handwriting angle. So I'll often ask for a video if it's something I have to do by mail, or I'll ask the user to write a sentence in front of me so I can judge the kind of tilt of the pen against the paper for the maximum contrast. And naginata. This is a slightly thorny issue, I think, that has been becoming clearer recently. The idea of a naginata is that it's an imitation of a brush pen. And by that, I mean that when you write Eastern scripts with this, when you write kanji, katakana, hiragana, or Chinese characters, or Korean, things like that, users tend to manipulate the pen a lot more. So when I write Chinese using a naginata nib, the angle of the pen against the paper changes a lot. And therefore, since the naginata is essentially a type of curved architect with line width variation from thin at the front to thick at the back, it allows me to show that variation more clearly. If you were to use a normal naginata, use a naginata, say by, from Sailor, for example, and if you were just to use the naginata at the same angle throughout, you would just get the same line width. So I know people who use these for drawing, and I know people who use this for writing Chinese calligraphy, for example. The other thing that East Asian people do, is the naginata the same as... Yes, so the naginata translates to long blade or long knife, and that refers to the kind of sweep of the underside of the nib. But to get the best effect from a naginata, a lot of Asian calligraphers will put a soft sponge layer under the page, and that allows them to either write on the very surface or press a little harder to allow more of the nib surface to contact the paper and get that sort of line variation that way. If you were just to use it normally in daily usage, I think that's much less the case for people who write Western languages, for example. Naginata I put in quotes also because it's apparently a trademarked word. So in Japan, naginata nibs are the nibs ground by the Nagahara father and son for sailor. So now that Nagahara has left sailor, he calls them kodachi nibs, and they are essentially the same shape. They are basically the same shape because they're ground by the same person. But he can't use that word. So when other people grind naginata shapes, they can't call that naginata in Japan. So you'll find CY has a name for them. For example, Matthew Chen has a name for them, whether it's the right way up or a reverse naginata where he grinds it on the reverse side of the nib. But that's just something to be aware of. People often they like to give names to what they see as their specialty. So Gina Salarino, for example, Custom Nib Studio, the small stubs are called journaler nibs. So you use them for, Hobonichi journaling, small size, stuff like that. I don't do that, but essentially it's the same idea, right? So going on, let's look at what constitutes a grind. For example, as an owner of many fine nibs, I ended up buying a macro lens recently so I could take photos. None of these photos are super clear just because I don't have the same amount of zoom on my camera. But here is a Pilot Custom Heritage 912 in fine. When we grind nibs, you have to kind of develop an intuition for the 3D geometry of a nib. And here is a drawing of the underside view in the middle here, the side view, and the front view of the nib when you're looking straight at the nib. So as you can see, this nib is slightly wider on the top side than the bottom. It has a little kind of slight curved geometry from the front. So only that area in the middle is actually contacting the paper. And when you look at it from the side, you normally write on here. Like that's the part that touches the paper when you normally hold your pen at, say, a 45 to 75 degree angle. And that's what Pilot defines as a fine. All right. So yeah, that's great. Let's get rid of that. And we can move on to the next slide, which is the equivalent size on a vanishing point. Now, these are much smaller. So you can, I tried to zoom on my phone and all I saw was dust specks. So that's that's a big dust speck. And as you can see, that's a much shorter distance because the nib is so much shorter. Although there's still this bulge here, this round bulge, and that's what contacts the paper. So that is Pilot's fine, and they are indeed the same size. Pilot's very consistent. They check all the nibs before leaving the factory, so this is quite nice to know that there's QC involved. Moving on, here's a Platinum 3776, and that's very, very different in shape. So even in the photo, you can see that there are flat facets. There's a flat side on the nib. And that's really strange. So when you draw the diagram of that, that's actually, this area is what touches paper, and that's the facet of the nib. That never actually touches the paper. So, if you decide to leave the sides of the nib curved or not, that's essentially an aesthetic decision. I sometimes, depending on what kind of pen and the shape of the nib and how flat the sides are, I sometimes curve it or I sometimes choose to leave it flat. And that has no effect on the actual writing. And as a laugh, I have a comparison of a pelican, which is not fine at all. Look at how much larger this one is. This is the famous Western versus Japanese distinction in nib sizes. So if you buy a Japanese pen, they tend to run a size smaller, or maybe even more than that sometimes. And here's the geometry. So because this is a silver color nib, I didn't manage to see where the tipping is. Like, I drew that extra line there to show the tipping, and this one doesn't have that. So it's much rounder, that is the line size, and when you write with it, you can feel that it's obviously much broader. So how does one plan a grind when you look at enough of these diagrams? I bought a lot of, I bought a number of nibs from people, or nibs from stock nibs from, Pelican, Pilot. I have my dad's Mont Blancs, and it's quite interesting when you look at them under a loop, because even from the same company, grinds change over time. Mont Blanc, Mont Blanc's nibs right now are stubbier than they used to be if you buy a medium and upward. They have a thin cross-stroke and a fatter downstroke, and the fatter downstroke is what they use to measure the nib size. So that if you buy a broad, you're essentially getting a small stub. Although that is not the case for an extra fine. The extra fines are really nice, but they're quite narrow and they can be quite architecty sometimes. So planning a grind, that's the fun part, right? So we move into the part where I attempt to, whoops, let me get rid of that annotation. There we go. Variation on the same grind. We talked about italics just now, and because the only thing that really influences your writing experience is the contact point of metal against paper, there is actually quite a lot of leeway to do what would write exactly the same in completely different shapes. So for example, this is a grind by Jose that I found on Reddit. It's an italic nib, and it's a smooth nib. You can see that it's slightly rounded at the front, but essentially it's quite blocky. It's definitely a flat, it's been lopped off, it's been ground into a flat shape. But there's a lot of extra material down at the bottom, underside of the nib, and that allows for a smooth writing experience. However, equally smooth is this italic by Mike Masuyama for Franklin Christoph. And look at how much less material is on the tipping here. Essentially carved into a knife edge. This can be quite sharp, but it is nevertheless still very, very smooth to use. And this difference fascinated me for a very long time. So I tried to do, variations using whetstones for a while, and then on my Dremel, I sometimes grind my own italics very different. If I grind them for people, I prefer the shape on the right. That's by Mike Masuyama. And so there are so many ways to do the same thing. An understanding of which parts of the metal is going to contact the paper is what you do to plan a grind. So let's plan one. I received 2 nibs from Omas yesterday, and I specifically asked them to send me one before cutting the nib. So that is a 1.5 millimeter blob of tipping right on the end of that nib. And as you can see, it's misaligned because they haven't set it into a feed. It doesn't really matter that it's misaligned. I would align it. I do align it before grinding, but it doesn't matter now because the feed presses against the nib and it might even out, and it doesn't, it's very, very minor. But I have such a big chunk of tipping to work with, so I can do something interesting with it, right? And what I think I would like to do today is I would like to demonstrate how I grind something reversible. And that means that I would like my nib to be a fine or extra fine daily writer, so I can use it comfortably this way. But also, I would like the reverse side to be fairly broad, so I can use it for headings. And how would I plan something like this? I start by drawing a diagram. That's what the nib looks like. It's very round. It's actually slit right down the middle, which is very nice. Some brands don't really have that tight control on this, and sometimes you find the tipping is off center and then cut straight down the middle as well. So various weirdnesses like this. But this is new production OMAS. It was sent to me from the US. This is the recent incarnation of OMAS. And what I would do to a blob like that, for example, is I would cut the shaded areas off, right? So the bottom part here is the fine, extra fine. That is the part that contacts the paper. And this area on the top is the broad. A side view of the nib shows a really big blob of tipping. And I would cut the bottom off at a slight curve because the point that touches the paper is the corner there, right at the front when you write with it normally. So as long as that point the arrow is pointing to is fairly smooth, it doesn't matter that the bottom is flat. All right. So once that's done, and I have a visualization of what that is in my head, then I can start doing the actual grind. And here I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to show you, like, in front of my computer, kind of how I cut the shapes and what it looks like when I'm grinding. So let me stop the sharing. Great. I'm going to move my camera here. And so I have my lamp and my little machine. What I've done before this thing started is I have put the nib into an ebonite feed that I have, and it's gone into a Leonardo. There we go. Can you all see this? Great. So almost nib, really, really fat tipping there. It's not really clear, but then, if you were sitting opposite me at a pen show, this is what you'd see. It's currently completely uninked. Some people prefer to grind inked. I prefer to cut the shape in and then test it with ink after that. So I do a basic shape. I prefer to do it uninked because the actual grinding portion often splashes ink everywhere. So I would cut the bottom first, like this. I'm flattening it out like I drew in the diagram. This is just, so I don't technically have to flatten all of the bottom out, but I do because I just choose to do that because it's a little bit more aesthetic. I want it to be fairly flat against the bottom of the nib. And so once I've done that, effectively the bottom is now completely flat, and it would write like a stub if I inked it up. So I have to cut the slope now, and this is the thing that gives me the extra fine or fine at the bottom. It's a lot quieter than a Dremel. It's basically the equivalent of a portable manicure tool. And that's why I use it. It's actually so much quieter. because this thing makes such a fearful noise. So I used to have that set up on my table. But this thing is so much more portable. So these days I've been offering to meet people in cafes and things like that so that I can grind for them on the spot. So I don't know if, okay, you know what? I'm going to try. Here's my macro lens that I'm going to hold up against that. And if you can see, the bottom is now quite flat. And it's really bright, I guess. The bottom of the nib is now quite flat. And that is going to be taken down into a point. And I do that. I can do that fairly rapidly using this. By holding the pen at an angle, I can just cut like this. And by doing that, you can see, I mean, I can see that the tipping is no longer plated. Of course, when you grind, you take away whatever plating is on it. And so I can see that it's silver now. But then all I really want to do is get that bottom to be shaped like a curved triangle. So on I go. Now the other side of the nib. There we go. A really nice facet. I'll fix this other side to be more symmetrical. And once that's cut, the remainder of the work is essentially cleanup. Let me see if I can show you. Let me see if I can show you this. So if you can see the bottom of the nib, you can see that it tapers to a point. I know it's not the clearest of images, actually. There we go. That's a bit better away from the light. Yes, so it tapers to a point. It's no longer quite that bright, that round shape anymore, right? But it's still really broad on the top. Sorry, this is not the best of images. And you can see, I think if you squint, you can see that there's a facet on the side, and that is the equivalent of the flat areas that I've cut. So now, this is the stage I would ink it up and test it out. So here's my bottle of Pilot Black. I pour it into this because it's deeper and so it's easier to dip larger pens if I need to. It always comes in bottles like this one when you buy a thing. So I've poured it out. Here we go. Moment of truth. And I have some Fabriano paper here to test. So that's a pretty good, yeah, I would be quite happy with that size. Whereas the reverse is, hang on a moment. There we go. The reverse is a bit broader, and has a little bit of a, it has a little bit of a facet as well. So that's broader on the back side and thinner here. Sorry, that's not focusing very well either. But you get the idea. So that is the fundamental kind of result that I would like to finish with. And then from here, the remainder of the steps involve polishing and getting rid of corners and, seeing whether I like how the nib writes. I prefer my nibs to be a little bit more feedbacky because I use Tomoe River paper almost exclusively. But if you were to use a nib like that on office paper or slightly more textured stuff at work, then you would want to smooth it out more. And often people often ask for glassy smooth or butter smooth pencils alongside Annabelle. She often teases that she often tells everyone around that I like scratchy nibs. So it's a little bit of a joke between the two of us, but essentially, that's it. That's pretty much a success. I'm fairly happy with that, and I'll go back and I'll, when the talk is over, I'll smooth this out. But that's what I do. That's a grind. That's an achieved decent result on a grind that I would actually ink up and use tomorrow. So yeah, thank you all for being patient with, messing around with cameras and lights and things like that. I hope that was kind of fairly instructive. That was educational anyway.
That was brilliant. That was really, really good. There's a couple of questions that we got. What would you say is your speciality nib?
Oh, I like doing very small stubs, I think. Stubs and italics. I do really small ones. In fact, actually, some of my favorite pens are vanishing points to do these on because I really like the convenience of doing this, coupled with the kind of writing flair that a stub gives you. I have 3 or 4 italics in my vanishing points. I really like that size, and you can get really nice effects with these. So I'm not sure if this is going to show up well, but if you've been at a pen show, you might have seen this page. That's not good.
Yeah, your
5
handwriting.
millimeters between each line. That's my finger for comparison, but that's italic writing. So that's just the kind of thing you can do. If you send off a pen to a nib person,
Oh, bless. Frozen again, if you can hear us.
whoops, sorry. It's just because getting a nib grinder to grind you a double-edged grinds on my VPN is remarkable. Thank you. That's really nice. If you don't have access to one of the original Sailor Naginatas, they are so expensive now. Basically, when Nagahara left, Sailor slapped a 300% markup on all the specialty grinds that he did. And so it's impossible to get without spending a fortune. Whereas a Naginata grind, from me or Jose is like 70 pounds-ish, 70 to 100, depending on how small it is. And a Sailor original is like 600 pounds these days, I think. So yeah, that gives people something. It's often easier to just send nib units to nib grinders. And if you just buy a whole bunch of Yovos, for example, like I have a bag of Yovo broad here, and I intend to go to pen shows and ask everyone to grind me an italic. And I'm going to study these to see which ones I like or what shapes are easier to reproduce. And then I take them on board. Like, I don't always have to grind nibs the exact same way. And in fact, when I looked at some of my older grinds, it is very, very different. I recently inked up one of the earliest grinds I did, and it's a Faber-Castell, and it's awful in the sense that I would never do that today. But it writes, kind of. There was the first gold nib, one of the first gold nibs I ever ground, and that was scary. I saw a question about what is the scariest pen. Yeah, I think it's very different when I'm grinding my own pens versus when I'm grinding something expensive someone has sent me. Because if it's my own pen, it's my fault if I screw it up, you know? But if someone sent, I think the most expensive pen I've ground for someone is one of those fancy Visconti special editions, which run, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 pounds. And that's terrifying. Oblique EF, yes, it's entirely possible. It's the same as an extra fine italic, I think. It depends on how crisp you're used to using. So the smaller a nib is, of course, the less variation is possible. And that's the limiting factor. The limiting factor actually is the width of the tine gap where the ink flows. And if your pen is wet, for example, then it doesn't matter. Like you're never going to get an italic out of that. You need to use a fairly dry nib to be able to get those hairlines that you really want from a very small italic. Most common grinds involve reduction. Yes, you can make a nib broader. It's called retipping. I don't do that. It involves welding, and you have to have much more equipment for that. Jose does that. Annabelle does that. Quite a few people do that. And welders have now branched out into doing stacked nibs. So if you follow Jose on his Instagram, you see these contraptions. These gigantic. I've got one here actually. I got one from CY. And the reason I've never got into this, to doing those, is because my handwriting is tiny. So I have one just to see how it works, but I can't do them and I would be terrified. So this is what they look like. Let me see. Let me grab. This is done on a platinum nib. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a nib in a different color. That's a second nib that's had its tines cut off and welded onto this one. So if you look at the end, actually, it's 4 tines and it's 2 on top of each other in this shape. So it's huge. Yeah, retipping is way much more of an effort. You have to weld the tipping on and cut the nib again and then grind it down to the size you want. So it's much more expensive. The plain retipping alone often costs, well, I think if you send it to anyone who does retipping, it is like easily a service that will run you 100, 150 pounds. So that's very, very different. And it's a scale of stuff I can't do. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to weld. So yeah, it's possible, but I don't know how to do it. I just,
Yeah.
I think it's so fun to be playing with all these things because if you're just like getting into using fountain pens then and frustrated with fine, medium, broad, then a nib grinder is the easiest way to get into having options. And having learned how to do it, it's very rare that a pen crosses my table. Like I buy a pen and I don't do something silly to it. In fact, the pens that I do the least to, I think they're all pilots because they're very, very nice. I like pilots. Soft fines, incredible. Fines are amazing. And then everything else I grind. What is the easiest grind to practice with? An italic is easiest. So that's one of the things I started out with. For example, let me pull up the slide again. Here, if you look at the Masuyama grind, for example, that's a really easy shape that you can get by using a whetstone, right? If you carve the nib down into a flat area and take the bottom and the top off, you get an italic. So that's one thing you can practice fairly easily, and it's not too bad. If in fact, that's what I did. I bought, 10 packs of Jinhao 92s, and those are really cheap, right? Like they cost maybe £15 for a half dozen, and you can buy them on AliExpress. And the good thing about AliExpress now is that there are so many cheap Chinese options that you can just buy to mock up. It's not too bad if you screw up something because you can just toss it. So that's what I did a lot. I did a lot of italics when I was first learning. I did a lot of kind of down to extra fine. Like, how was I going to do that? Was I able to curve the bottom so that it was still relatively smooth? And then I used micro mesh to make it smoother. And that's how I practiced. Yeah, it's possible to learn, I think. And in fact, I think it would be great if more people took this up because there's not very many of us.
Well, one of the questions, well, there's a couple that we missed. What's the difference between small stub and cursive italic?
The difference between a stub and an italic is essentially the kind of ratio between thick and thin. So a small stub versus a small italic, you would get like super fine hairlines on the italic. But it would be therefore more fussy to use. You would have to have it absolutely flat against the paper um to get that really thin line, or you would end up cutting the paper if you rotated your nib. Whereas a stub is slightly more rounded along the sides, and therefore just a little bit more tolerant at the expense of the contrast between thick and thin. So, a stub might be fairly round, but just a little thicker when you downstroke, whereas an italic would be like a hairline and then a thicker stroke downwards. So it's very, very different. Have I ever tried softening a nib to make it more flexible? Yes, I've had a few attempts. And this really, really depends on the kind of nibs that you start with and the structure they have. So often there's actually one here that I tried something different with. I have a pilot. This was a very, very expensive. This was a bit of a mistake actually. So I've done things to steel nibs where I take, the structure, I thin the thickness of the nib at its tip. So I've actually I pulled this nib out, I cut this to a thinner swoop so that it gets thinner much earlier in the nib, and it does add some bounce. And I thin down the underside of the nib to allow more flex as well. So this nib is no longer as hard as a pilot fine would be. I did not touch the tipping. I only changed the structure of the nib. I don't know if I would call this a success. So I feel like I'm going to chip away at it a little more. But yes, it's possible. And sometimes people want me to do really drastic things at shows. So at Pacific Northwest Pen Show, someone handed me a sailor and was like, can you cut curves into the side so it looks like a pilot FA nib? And I said, it's absolutely irreversible. Like, are you sure you want me to do that? So yes, it's possible. And many people do it differently. So I have a few softer bounce nibs from several people. I've got one from CY. I've got one from Audrey at Franklin Christoph. And that's pretty cool. What's the most interesting grind I've been asked to produce? Someone asked for a stub on one side and an architect on the other. And that's really hard. I said, look, I'm going to take a while to get back to you on this. I'm going to practice on my own before I say yes. But it takes like an hour to do because essentially what you need to do is cut the thing into a T shape, right? So the flat side is the normal side when you write, and the customer wanted it to flip around to be an architect. So I had to cut it at roughly like an angle like this. But to be an architect, you can't have a flat side. So it really had to be like slightly further back on the tipping. And so the shape ended up being like, yeah, no, it was really complex. And I would never do that at a show. Absolutely not. Uh,
Is,
absolutely
is,
not.
is there any way to add feedback to a smooth nib?
Yeah, you run it over a lower grid micro mesh. So 4000, a light line, 2 circles, and you have feedback.
Okay.
Yeah. I often do that. I often do that to my own pens. When I buy things like Pelicans, I find them too smooth against Tomoyo River. They are very wet. And if you use Iroshizuku inks, you'll find that there's too much flow. So I want just a little bit more contact with the paper so I know where it is. Yeah.
Brilliant. Can you create something similar to a pilot signature nib?
So I haven't used one. But yes, if I saw one and I studied one, I would be able to copy the shape. This is like, in fact, there's a very interesting nib grinder in
sorry.
Taipei, and he is the fastest guy I know. So some of my friends in East Asia, they often do these like group orders where they pull together 20, 30 pens. They send it to him and he'll send it back in a week. And he's very good at imitating certain shapes. So they'll tell him they want things like a 1970s Mont Blanc, and he'll cut the exact same shape. Or they'll send him a Nagahara original, and the Naginata shapes from the Nagahara son and the father are different. They'll send him pens and they'll be like, I want this one to be the Naginata shape from the father and this one to be the Naginata shape from the son, and he'll copy them. And this is like a way that I used to learn things. I buy nibs, I draw diagrams, and I attempt to do the same thing over and over again. So yeah, I would be able to do that if I saw one in real life and got a proper look at it.
What's
Implementing flex.
yeah.
This is very much to do with the nib structure. So if you have the material, like for example, platinum nibs are really thick. They have a very thick cross section. So flex on those is much harder. I would have to like half the thickness of the nib for it to actually spread. Whereas if you look at a platinum soft fine, what it does is it doesn't really spread very much, but it is bouncy. And that is also a structural shape thing. A lot of it, if you look at vintage nibs, for example, the breather hole is much further back, or the tines are longer. And if the tines are longer and they have a finer sweep, it makes flex easier. You can find modern examples actually. I have a good blue titanium flex nib here, and this one doesn't even have a breather hole, right? If you've used any of the good blue nibs, you know there's a cutout here, which means that, you know, structurally speaking, the nib bends from here, and then you do that and it opens up, right? So nib shape, nib structure, tine lengths, where you cut and how thin the nib is this way, they all really affect things. There are some very interesting nib workers that have worked with changing the shape of the tines or cutting extra slits. So if you buy a Yovo elastic nib, you can see that it sometimes, where's my example? There's like a little hole cut out at the side, and that helps it to bend. And if you look up, for example, Ralph Reyes, the crossflex nib is a Yovo nib that has slits cut horizontally from the breather hole out to the side. And that adds a different sort of structural flex from, say, Pilot's FA nib, which is, you know, if anyone asks me to do a flex mod, I would cut those curves because that's the easiest thing to do. Whereas if you were to cut or extend the tines, you need more specialized, you know, jewelry cutting tools for that. But these are all ways that people have been investigating to come up with flex. The desire to replicate flex is very interesting. Good Blue in particular is working on a few prototypes. Amazing stuff. like nothing I've ever seen. So that's something to keep an eye on. Yeah.
Do you have a sample of writing of a Nagiata that you have created?
Yes. Actually, I might find I might find one. I think it's probably easier to it's very easy to demonstrate what a naginata does on the spot. So let me find my pen here. Whereas actual writing with it is probably harder to show. So I'm going to quickly show what a naginata does. And the easiest way to look at it is from the side, right? Okay, I'm not sure if that's lit properly. There we go. I hope this is clear. Sorry about the focus. If I
It's
hold
clear enough.
a pen vertically, that's the thinnest a naginata would write. Right? And as I go downwards, then it gets broader. So that's closer to a fine. That's visibly, I'm sorry, it's not really in focus. That's visibly broader, and that is the broadest, right? So if I were to write Chinese, for example, I would put something soft under it, like say a couple layers of paper napkin. Smooth that out. And then you could press into paper and get some of these really nice lines. And that, for example, that stroke is a very good demonstration. But in particular for naginata purposes, this kind of that is a demonstration of what a naginata does. So it's thick here and thin at the bottom. There are several really, really cool Instagram calligraphers. I can link some. In particular, this guy, when I was talking to CY, Tokyo Station Pens, he laughed and he said, I'm going to paste this in chat. He laughed and he said that people thought that he was this person because he's been using a lot of, he's been using a lot of the Kyuseido Kakari pens. But the videos that he posts are incredible, and I've been studying these. So here's a fantastic example of what a stacked nib does, what a soft stacked nib does. This is a CY speciality, and how you can use that variation in width to truly write something that looks like a brush. It is pretty amazing. You can also tell when he writes in this video that there's something under the paper. There's a guide sheet, but also something soft under that, so you can see him pressed into the paper and out. And it's truly mesmerizing to watch. I spent hours scrolling this thing and trying to imitate this sort of writing. But on my own Kakari nib, my shoulders are not, my nib shoulders are not sloped as much as in this video. And that's a flex thing. Like CY has added flex to this nib for this particular user. And there we go. That's a person who knows how to do that.
There is a question, is it similar to a zoom nib?
Yes, I think the fundamental idea that the nib size changes as your angle changes is the same, but they change in different ways. So zooms are more blobby at the front, but naginatas, in particular, to grind a really nice naginata, I always look for tipping that's long. So I want it to extend further back down the nib so I can get that really, really nice sweep. And the longer it is, if a couple millimeters is ideal, but often you get something like a millimeter of tipping and that's it. Yeah. Let me turn this off. Yeah, I hope that's useful. I feel like for me as a nib grinder, I've been grinding nibs since 2016 for myself, and since I would say 2018 for the friends who used to go to the London meetups. And then I've only done shows for 2 years. So I started in 2023 to do the shows. So I wouldn't consider myself like a master at the craft. There's still tons for me to learn, and I still want to get more nibs from people to study. And eventually maybe one day I'll do Tokyo Pen Show. I think that's like the aim for me.
Somebody did ask where you were based.
I live in London. I do nibbook in London. London Pen Show is my home show. I do a lot of nibbook by mail, but also if you are in London and you can fit my schedule, I am more than happy to meet at a cafe, to do a grind on the spot.
I'm
So
gonna
we
check
don't so that neither of us has to deal with the post office, especially around Christmas. Yeah. Have I tried an extra fine? I grind some pretty brutal needle points. So 0.1-ish, slightly less if the material is not soft. You can get like a 0.05 nib with a steel nib. It has to be very dry to write that small. But it will write. Yeah, thank you all for stopping by. And
No, thank you for doing it. Do we have any more questions? If not, I will announce tonight's winner. Lots and lots of thank yous. It was really good. It was really good, Tom. It's really
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. So I did spend some time writing everybody's name down, and the random number selector picked number 24, and that is actually Nick Worley. So Nick, I'll drop you a message and I'll put you in touch with Art from the Heart, and you've won tonight's gift from them.
What is the gift?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
That's a conversation to have with Art from the Heart.
I'm sure we'll see it on Fountain Pens UK Facebook group.
What I'll do now first is I'll stop recording, and then
Fantastic.
we can generally happy to stick around if anybody wants to stick around, but we'll take it from there.